双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
Chronicles of the Canongate by Sir Walter Scott. Contents: Introduction to Chronicles of the Canongate. Appendix to Introduction the Theatrical Fund Dinner. Introductory Mr. Crystal Croftangry. The Highland Widow. The Two Drovers. Notes. Introduction to Chronicles of the Canongate. The preceding volume of this collection concluded the last of the pieces originally published under the nominis umbra of the author of Waverley, and the circumstances which rendered it impossible for the writer to continue longer in the possession of his incognito were communicated in 1827. In the introduction to the first series of Chronicles of the Canongate, consisting, besides a biographical sketch of the imaginary chronicler, of 3 tales, entitled The Highland Widow, The Two Drovers, and The Surgeon's Daughter. In the present volume, the 2 first named of these pieces are included, together with 3 detached stories which appeared the year after, in the elegant compilation called The Keepsake. The Surgeon's Daughter, it is thought better to defer until a succeeding volume, than to begin and break off in the middle. I have, perhaps, said enough on former occasions of the misfortunes which led to the dropping of that mask under which I had, for a long series of years, enjoyed so large a portion of public favor. Through the success of those literary efforts, I had been enabled to indulge most of the tastes which a retired person of my station might be supposed to entertain. In the pen of this nameless romancer, I seemed to possess something like the secret fountain of coined gold and pearls vouchsafed to the traveler of the Eastern tale, and no doubt believed that I might venture, without silly imprudence, to extend my personal expenditure considerably beyond what I should have thought of, had my means been limited to the competence which I derived from inheritance. With the moderate income of a professional situation, I bought, and built, and planted, and was considered by myself, as by the rest of the world, in the safe possession of an easy fortune. My riches, however, like the other riches of this world, were liable to accidents, under which they were ultimately destined to make unto themselves wings, and fly away. The year 1825, so disastrous to many branches of industry and commerce, did not spare the market of literature, and the sudden ruin that fell on so many of the booksellers could scarcely have been expected to leave unscathed one whose career had of necessity connected him deeply and extensively with the pecuniary transactions of that profession. In a word, almost without one note of premonition, I found myself involved in the sweeping catastrophe of the unhappy time, and called on to meet the demands of creditors upon commercial establishments with which my fortunes had long been bound up, to the extent of no less a sum than £120,000, the author having, however rashly, committed his pledges thus largely to the hazards of trading companies. It behoved him, of course, to abide the consequences of his conduct, and, with whatever feelings, he surrendered on the instant every shred of property which he had been accustomed to call his own. It became vested in the hands of gentlemen whose integrity, prudence, and intelligence were combined with all possible liberality and kindness of disposition, and who readily afforded every assistance towards the execution of plans, in the success of which the author contemplated the possibility of his ultimate extrication, and which were of such a nature that, had assistance of this sort been withheld, he could have had little prospect of carrying them into effect. Among other resources which occurred was the project of that complete and corrected edition of his novels and romances, whose real parentage had of necessity been disclosed at the moment of the commercial convulsions alluded to, which has now advanced with unprecedented favor nearly to its close, but as he purposed also to continue, for the behoof of those to whom he was indebted, the exercise of his pen in the same path of literature, so long as the taste of his countrymen should seem to approve of his efforts. It appeared to him that it would have been an idle piece of affectation to attempt getting up a new incognito, after his original visor had been thus dashed from his brow. hence the personal narrative prefixed to the first work of fiction which he put forth after the paternity of the Waverley novels had come to be publicly ascertained. And though many of the particulars originally avowed in that notice have been unavoidably adverted to in the prefaces and notes to some of the preceding volumes of the present collection, it is now reprinted as it stood at the time, because some interest is generally attached to a coin or medal struck on a special occasion, as expressing, perhaps, more faithfully than the same artist could have afterwards conveyed, the feelings of the moment that gave it birth. The introduction to the first series of Chronicles of the Canongate ran, then, in these words: Introduction. All who are acquainted with the early history of the Italian stage are aware that Arlecchino is not, in his original conception, a mere worker of marvels with his wooden sword, a jumper in and out of windows, as upon our theatre, but, as his party-colored jacket implies, a buffoon or clown, whose mouth, far from being eternally closed, as amongst us, is filled, like that of Touchstone, with quips, and cranks, and witty devices, very often delivered extempore. It is not easy to trace how he became possessed of his black vizard, which was anciently made in the resemblance of the face of a cat, but it seems that the mask was essential to the performance of a character, as will appear from the following theatrical anecdote. An actor on the Italian stage permitted at the Foire du Saint-Germain, in Paris, was renowned for the wild, venturous, and extravagant wit, the brilliant sallies and fortunate repartees, with which he prodigally seasoned the character of the party-colored jester. Some critics, whose goodwill towards a favorite performer was stronger than their judgment, took occasion to remonstrate with the successful actor on the subject of the grotesque vizard. They went wilily to their purpose, observing that his classical and Attic wit, his delicate vein of humor, his happy turn for dialogue, were rendered burlesque and ludicrous by this unmeaning and bizarre disguise, and that those attributes would become far more impressive if aided by the spirit of his eye and the expression of his natural features. The actor's vanity was easily so far engaged as to induce him to make the experiment. He played Harlequin barefaced, but was considered on all hands as having made a total failure. He had lost the audacity which a sense of incognito bestowed, and with it all the reckless play of raillery which gave vivacity to his original acting. He cursed his advisers, and resumed his grotesque vizard, but, it is said, without ever being able to regain the careless and successful levity which the consciousness of the disguise had formerly bestowed. Perhaps the author of Waverley is now about to incur a risk of the same kind, and endanger his popularity by having laid aside his incognito. It is certainly not a voluntary experiment, like that of Harlequin, for it was my original intention never to have avowed these works during my lifetime, and the original manuscripts were carefully preserved, though by the care of others rather than mine, with the purpose of supplying the necessary evidence of the truth when the period of announcing it should arrive. These manuscripts are at present, August 1831, advertised for public sale, which is an addition, though a small one, to other annoyances. But the affairs of my publishers having, unfortunately, passed into a management different from their own, I had no right any longer to rely upon secrecy in that quarter. And thus my mask, like my Aunt Dinah's in Tristram Shandy, having begun to wax a little threadbare about the chin, it became time to lay it aside with a good grace, unless I desired it should fall in pieces from my face, which was now become likely. Yet I had not the slightest intention of selecting the time and place in which the disclosure was finally made. Nor was there any concert betwixt my learned and respected friend Lord Meadowbank and myself upon that occasion. It was, as the reader is probably aware, upon the February 23rd last, at a public meeting, called for establishing a professional theatrical fund in Edinburgh, that the communication took place. Just before we sat down to table, Lord Meadowbank, one of the supreme judges of Scotland, termed Lords of Council and Session, asked me privately whether I was still anxious to preserve my incognito on the subject of what were called the Waverley novels. I did not immediately see the purpose of his lordship's question, although I certainly might have been led to infer it, and replied that the secret had now of necessity become known to so many people that I was indifferent on the subject. Lord Meadowbank was thus induced, while doing me the great honor of proposing my health to the meeting, to say something on the subject of these novels, so strongly connecting them with me as the author, that by remaining silent I must have stood convicted, either of the actual paternity, or of the still greater crime of being supposed willing to receive indirectly praise to which I had no just title. I thus found myself suddenly and unexpectedly placed in the confessional, and had only time to recollect that I had been guided thither by a most friendly hand, and could not, perhaps, find a better public opportunity to lay down a disguise which began to resemble that of a detected masquerader. I had therefore the task of avowing myself to the numerous and respectable company assembled as the sole and unaided author of these novels of Waverley, the paternity of which was likely at one time to have formed a controversy of some celebrity, for the ingenuity with which some instructors of the public gave their assurance on the subject was extremely persevering. I now think it further necessary to say that, while I take on myself all the merits and demerits attending these compositions, I am bound to acknowledge with gratitude hints of subjects and legends which I have received from various quarters, and have occasionally used as a foundation of my fictitious compositions, or woven up with them in the shape of episodes. I am bound, in particular, to acknowledge the unremitting kindness of Mr. Joseph Train, Supervisor of Excise at Dumfries, to whose unwearied industry I have been indebted for many curious traditions and points of antiquarian interest. It was Mr. Train who brought to my recollection the history of old mortality, although I myself had had a personal interview with that celebrated wanderer so far back as about 1792, when I found him on his usual task. He was then engaged in repairing the gravestones of the Covenanters who had died while imprisoned in the castle of Dunatar, to which many of them were committed prisoners at the period of Argyll's rising. Their place of confinement is still called the Whig's Vault. Mr. Train, however, procured for me far more extensive information concerning this singular person, whose name was Patterson, than I had been able to acquire during my own short conversation with him. See, for some further particulars, the notes to Old Mortality, in the present collective edition. He was, as I think I have somewhere already stated, a native of the parish of Clospin, in Dumfriesshire, and it is believed that domestic affliction, as well as devotional feeling, induced him to commence the wandering mode of life which he pursued for a very long period. It is more than 20 years since Robert Patterson's death, which took place on the highroad near Lockerbie, where he was found exhausted and expiring. The white pony, the companion of his pilgrimage, was standing by the side of its dying master, the whole furnishing a scene not unfitted for the pencil. These particulars I had from Mr. Train. Another debt, which I pay most willingly, I owe to an unknown correspondent, a lady, the late Mrs. Goldie, who favored me with a history of the upright and high-principled female, whom, in the heart of Midlothian, I have termed Jeanie Deans. The circumstance of her refusing to save her sister's life by an act of perjury, and undertaking a pilgrimage to London to obtain her pardon, are both represented as true by my fair and obliging correspondent, and they led me to consider the possibility of rendering a fictitious personage interesting by mere dignity of mind and rectitude of principle, assisted by unpretending good sense and temper, without any of the beauty, grace, talent, accomplishment, and wit to which a heroine of romance is supposed to have a prescriptive right, if the portrait was received with interest by the public. I am conscious how much it was owing to the truth and force of the original sketch, which I regret that I am unable to present to the public, as it was written with much feeling and spirit. Old and odd books, and a considerable collection of family legends, formed another quarry, so ample that it was much more likely that the strength of the laborer should be exhausted than that materials should fail. I may mention, for example's sake, that the terrible catastrophe of the Bride of Lammermoor actually occurred in a Scottish family of rank. the female relative, by whom the melancholy tale was communicated to me many years since, was a near connection of the family in which the event happened, and always told it with an appearance of melancholy mystery, which enhanced the interest. She had known in her youth the brother who rode before the unhappy victim to the fatal altar, who, though then a mere boy, and occupied almost entirely with the gaiety of his own appearance in the bridal procession, could not but remark that the hand of his sister was moist, and cold as that of a statue. It is unnecessary further to withdraw the veil from this scene of family distress, nor, although it occurred more than 100 years since, might it be altogether agreeable to the representatives of the families concerned in the narrative. It may be proper to say that the events alone are imitated, but I had neither the means nor intention of copying the manners, or tracing the characters, of the persons concerned in the real story. Indeed, I may here state generally that, although I have deemed historical personages free subjects of delineation, I have never on any occasion violated the respect due to private life. It was indeed impossible that traits proper to persons, both living and dead, with whom I have had intercourse in society, should not have risen to my pen in such works as Waverley, and those which followed it, but I have always studied to generalize the portraits, so that they should still seem, on the whole, the productions of fancy, though possessing some resemblance to real individuals. Yet I must own my attempts have not in this last particular been uniformly successful. There are men whose characters are so peculiarly marked, that the delineation of some leading and principal feature inevitably places the whole person before you in his individuality. Thus, the character of Jonathan Oldbuck, in The Antiquary, was partly founded on that of an old friend of my youth, to whom I am indebted for introducing me to Shakespeare, and other invaluable favors. But I thought I had so completely disguised the likeness that his features could not be recognized by anyone now alive. I was mistaken, however, and indeed had endangered what I desired should be considered as a secret, for I afterwards learned that a highly respectable gentleman, one of the few surviving friends of my father, and an acute critic, James Chalmers, Askew, solicitor at law, London, who died during the publication of the present edition of these novels, August 1831, had said, upon the appearance of the work, that he was now convinced who was the author of it, as he recognized in the Antiquary of Monkbarns traces of the character of a very intimate friend of my father's family. I may here also notice that the sort of exchange of gallantry which is represented as taking place betwixt the Baron of Bradwardine and Colonel Talbot is a literal fact. The real circumstances of the anecdote, alike honourable to Whig and Tory, are these. Alexander Stewart of Invernahyle, name which I cannot write without the warmest recollections of gratitude to the friend of my childhood, who first introduced me to the Highlands, their traditions, and their manners, had been engaged actively in the troubles of 1745. As he charged at the Battle of Preston with his clan, the Stuarts of Appin, he saw an officer of the opposite army standing alone by a battery of 4 cannon, of which he discharged 3 on the advancing Highlanders, and then drew his sword. Invernahyle rushed on him, and required him to surrender. Never to rebels, was the undaunted reply, accompanied with a lunge, which the Highlander received on his target, but instead of using his sword in cutting down his now defenseless antagonist, he employed it in parrying the blow of a Lochaber axe aimed at the officer by the miller, one of his own followers, a grim-looking old Highlander, whom I remember to have seen. Thus overpowered, Lieutenant Colonel Alan Whiteford, a gentleman of rank and consequence, as well as a brave officer, gave up his sword, and with it his purse and watch, which Invernahyle accepted, to save them from his followers. After the affair was over, Mr. Stewart sought out his prisoner, and they were introduced to each other by the celebrated John Roy Stewart, who acquainted Colonel Whiteford with the quality of his captor, and made him aware of the necessity of receiving back his property, which he was inclined to leave in the hands into which it had fallen. So great became the confidence established betwixt them, that Invernahyle obtained from the Chevalier his prisoner's freedom upon parole, and soon afterwards, having been sent back to the Highlands to raise men, he visited Colonel Whiteford at his own house, and spent 2 happy days with him and his Whig friends, without thinking on either side of the Civil War, which was then raging. When the Battle of Culloden put an end to the hopes of Charles Edward, Invernahyle, wounded and unable to move, was borne from the field by the faithful zeal of his retainers. But as he had been a distinguished Jacobite, his family and property were exposed to the system of vindictive destruction too generally carried into execution through the country of the insurgents. It was now Colonel Whiteford's turn to exert himself, and he wearied all the authorities, civil and military, with his solicitations for pardon to the saver of his life, or, at least, for a protection for his wife and family. His applications were for a long time unsuccessful. "I was found with the mark of the beast upon me in every list," was Invernahyle's expression. At length Colonel Whiteford applied to the Duke of Cumberland, and urged his suit with every argument which he could think of. Being still repulsed, he took his commission from his bosom, and having said something of his own and his family's exertions in the cause of the House of Hanover, begged to resign his situation in their service, since he could not be permitted to show his gratitude to the person to whom he owed his life. The Duke, struck with his earnestness, desired him to take up his commission, and granted the protection required for the family of Invernahyle. The chieftain himself lay concealed in a cave near his own house, before which a small body of regular soldiers were encamped. He could hear their muster roll called every morning, and their drums beat to quarters at night, and not a change of the sentinels escaped him, as it was suspected that he was lurking somewhere on the property. His family were closely watched, and compelled to use the utmost precaution in supplying him with food. One of his daughters, a child of 8 or 10 years old, was employed as the agent least likely to be suspected. She was an instance, among others, that a time of danger and difficulty creates a premature sharpness of intellect. She made herself acquainted among the soldiers, till she became so familiar to them that her motions escaped their notice, and her practice was to stroll away into the neighborhood of the cave, and leave what slender supply of food she carried for that purpose under some remarkable stone, or the root of some tree, where her father might find it as he crept by night from his lurking place. Times became milder, and my excellent friend was relieved from prescription by the Act of Indemnity. Such is the interesting story, which I have rather injured than improved by the manner in which it is told in Waverley. This incident, with several other circumstances illustrating the tales in question, was communicated by me to my late lamented friend, William Erskine, a Scottish judge, by the title of Lord Kinder, who afterwards reviewed with far too much partiality the tales of my landlord for the Quarterly Review of January 1817. Lord Kinder died in August 1822. August 1831. In the same article are contained other illustrations of the novels, with which I supplied my accomplished friend, who took the trouble to write the review. The reader who is desirous of such information will find the original of Meg Merrilies, and, I believe, of 1 or 2 other personages of the same cast of character, in the article referred to. I may also mention that the tragic and savage circumstances which are represented as preceding the birth of Alan Macaulay in the Legend of Montrose really happened in the family of Stuart of Ardvoirlich. The wager about the candlesticks, whose place was supplied by Highland torchbearers, was laid and won by one of the MacDonalds of Keppoch. There can be but little amusement in winnowing out the few grains of truth which are contained in this mass of empty fiction. I may, however, before dismissing the subject, allude to the various localities which have been affixed to some of the scenery introduced into these novels, by which, for example, Wolf's Hope is identified with Fast Castle in Berwickshire, Tilliatidlum with Drafane in Clydesdale, and the valley in the monastery, called Glendark, with the dale of the River Allen, above Lord Somerville's villa, near Melrose. I can only say that, in these and other instances, I had no purpose of describing any particular local spot, and the resemblance must therefore be of that general kind which necessarily exists between scenes of the same character. The iron-bound coast of Scotland affords upon its headlands and promontories 50 such castles as Wolf's Hope. Every county has a valley more or less resembling Glendarg. And if castles like Tilliatiblam, or mansions like the Baron of Bradwardine's, are now less frequently to be met with, it is owing to the rage of indiscriminate destruction, which has removed or ruined so many monuments of antiquity, when they were not protected by their inaccessible situation. I would particularly intimate the Kaim of Urich, on the eastern coast of Scotland, as having suggested an idea for the tower called Wolf's Crag, which the public more generally identified with the ancient tower of Fast Castle. The scraps of poetry which have been in most cases tacked to the beginning of chapters in these novels are sometimes quoted either from reading or from memory, but, in the general case, are pure invention. I found it too troublesome to turn to the collection of the British poets to discover apposite mottos. And, in the situation of the theatrical mechanist, who, when the white paper which represented his shower of snow was exhausted, continued the storm by snowing brown, I drew on my memory as long as I could, and when that failed, eked it out with invention. I believe that in some cases, where actual names are affixed to the supposed quotations, it would be to little purpose to seek them in the works of the authors referred to. In some cases I have been entertained when Dr. Watts and other graver authors have been ransacked in vain for stanzas for which the novelist alone was responsible. And now the reader may expect me, while in the confessional, to explain the motives why I have so long persisted in disclaiming the works of which I am now writing. To this it would be difficult to give any other reply, save that of Corporal and why it was the author's humor or caprice for the time. I hope it will not be construed into ingratitude to the public, to whose indulgence I have owed my sang-froid much more than to any merit of my own, if I confess that I am, and have been, more indifferent to success or to failure as an author, than may be the case with others, who feel more strongly the passion for literary fame, probably because they are justly conscious of a better title to it. It was not until I had attained the age of 30 years that I made any serious attempt at distinguishing myself as an author, and at that period men's hopes, desires, and wishes have usually acquired something of a decisive character, and are not eagerly and easily diverted into a new channel. When I made the discovery, for to me it was one that, by amusing myself with composition,